Hello, my name is Holly Romine, and today I'm going to be presenting on the war on drugs that's occurring in the Philippines. So let's take a brief overview of what this war on drugs is. It began on June 30th, 2016 in the Philippines, and it was a campaign that was led by the most recently elected president, Rodrigo Duterte, and his administration. Essentially, it served the purpose of reducing drug proliferation within the country. Unfortunately, it was marred by extrajudicial killings by both police, unknown assailants, vigilantes, and many, many other people. And this caused many human rights groups to condemn this campaign to end this drug war. Duterte's successor, Bongbong Marcos, did end up continuing this campaign at the request of Duterte, but much to the dismay of many, many international rights groups. His campaign, though, was, it did include this policy shift. He wanted to focus more on drug abuse prevention, education, and improvement of rehabilitation centers. So let's talk a little bit about why the Philippines has an issue with drugs in the first place. When I first learned that they had a massive drug war, I was quite confused because I didn't realize that they had so many drugs within the country. And mainly what is causing this increase in drug trade is its geographical location. It has enormous coastlines with very porous borders, so it's fairly easy to get drugs into and out of this country. This makes it a very critical transshipment hub for the illegal drug trade. And that's done by international drug syndicates, local drug syndicates, gangs, drug mules, and just the average person. What's mostly being transported and traded is methamphetamine and marijuana at this time. Part of what's thought to have created this massive boom in the illegal drug trade was the new millennium. Across the world, everywhere was seeing a boom in the illegal drug industry. The Philippines specifically makes about $6.4 to $8.4 billion annually just because of this illegal drug trade. But what's interesting is their drug usage is lower than the global average. So that kind of indicates that it's not Filipinos that are utilizing these drugs, it's other people that are bringing them into and out of this country. So the solution to this growth of illegal drugs was the nomination of Rodrigo Duterte for president. So let's kind of talk about that. Initially, Rodrigo Duterte was the mayor of Davao City, and his time as mayor was noted for its economic boom of the city and decreased crime, which he took as justification for this campaign against drugs. The decrease in crime has recently been objected to a little bit, but there's no real way to know exactly whether he actually caused a decrease in crime or not, because the numbers are very skewed and all over the place. After his time as mayor, he did run for president of the Philippines, and he won in a massive landslide. People liked him because he was a man of the people, for the people. He wasn't afraid to criticize the government or current issues within the Philippines, and people really liked that. They felt like he wasn't lying to them and being another politician. So he was pretty popular for this presidential campaign. As soon as he got president, he immediately started this campaign against drugs. He didn't like how lackadaisical the border control was. So that was something that he really wanted to see improve. And he also felt like there was a lot of government officials and law enforcement officials that were feeding into this issue of this illegal drug trade. He thought a lot of them were getting their palms greased to let people continue to do it within their country. And then the entire drug war falls after that, which we'll discuss here in a minute more. But after his presidency, he just returned to Davao. This was in 2022. And he's maintained a fairly low profile since then, but he has retained his popularity with his supporters specifically. And that's kind of where he's at today. So this new drug policy, which was initially meant to just lower the amount of drugs that were being traded and brought into the Philippines, as we now know, was extrapolated to be very violent and lead to the death of many Filipinos. And that led to a lot of criticisms of this new drug policy by many international groups as well as locals. One of the more vocal groups is the Human Rights Watch group. And that's an international group that kind of focuses more on human rights and what's being violated within countries. And their criticism is essentially that these are just massive crimes against humanity that's specifically targeting their urban poor populations, as well as utilizing a corrupt law enforcement system to maintain and lower the amount of drugs that are being bought and traded in the Philippines. The international world as a whole feels the same way. They feel like these extrajudicial killings are very, very not okay, and they are violating human rights. A lot of the international world also believes that Duterte just has very murderous intentions because he said from the get-go, if you're a drug user, abuser, or trader, I have no problems killing you. And that's kind of where a lot of the international world sees him as a murderer, and they want him to be held accountable for those crimes. And then within the country, there was quite a bit of criticism within the country as well. There was local criticism, and one of the most outspoken Filipino natives was Senator Leila de Lima, who did just get released from prison. But she essentially called an end to these vigilante killings. And what ended up happening was there was a lot of coercion and falsified statements, supposedly, that got her thrown into prison and removed from her position within the government to kind of keep her quiet so that she couldn't speak out against these problems. Additionally, anytime complaints were filed against these human rights violations, they were just junked by the Senate and ignored. And this led to a lot of protests, both about getting Senator de Lima out of jail, but also to just stop the madness of this drug policy. So that's kind of some of the criticisms that they started to see, and that we still see prevalent to this day. So where does that put us now? So let's kind of look at what the evolution of the war on drugs has occurred. So pre-2016, Duterte was the mayor of Davao City. And during this time, this is when he really started this war against drugs. He wanted to stop the drugs within Davao City, and that just kind of extrapolated till we got to 2016 when he was elected as president. And this is when he started his relentless fight against illegal drugs. This led to a lot of murders, misconducts by multiple people, and generally just a pretty negative way to go about the want to stop the illegal drug trade. Between 2016 and 2022, which was Duterte's presidential time, 6,229 drug personalities were killed within the Philippines. And going into 2022 to now, we see President Marcos come in. He does continue this war, supposedly, with new policies focusing on prevention, education, and improvement. From a lot of the Western sources that I read, they don't believe that any of that is happening, but it's really just Duterte's war continuing to be fought by Marcos. And the estimated death toll of these murders to this day is 12,000 individuals. And this leads to a lot of different questions. There's many criticisms of this policy by people both externally and internally, but there's also a lot of people that feel like it's the right thing to do. So this poses many questions that are tricky to answer and don't really have an answer, but that I think are important to think about. So essentially, what role does the Western world play within this situation? The Western world has much to say about it. There's plenty of news articles written about it, all of them inserting their opinions. And the real question is where do they get a role? Do they not get a role? And are they allowed to say anything on this matter? Because it's not their country and they don't know the internal workings of it, yet they're still giving their opinion. Another question is, should outside entities step in? If this is such a massive issue of human rights violations, should other entities step in to try to end this war, or where does that fall? And that's also difficult because, again, who is anybody else to step in and say, well, this is a crime against humanity and this doesn't, and this isn't. And we're going to come in and step in and kind of fix what we think is broken. And that's a very imperialistic viewpoint, but one that many of the Western societies have. And again, who's to say what isn't a crime against humanity? Not everybody understands the different cultural implications that occur across the world. What may seem wrong to our culture is completely fine in another. And it gets pretty difficult to say after a while. Who decides what should be done and what should be done? Again, it's a tricky answer for a tricky situation, and there really isn't a perfect answer. And how does this war on drugs differ from any other across the world? The Western world is very outspoken, but they've also had their own war on drugs, as have most countries within the world. And so these are all just kind of some reflection questions that I think are important to ask ourselves. And it's difficult to find an answer because it is a really tricky situation. However, I think it really puts into perspective what's going on, and forcing you to view it from a viewpoint outside of yours and look at it from the Philippines point of view. Thank you for listening. These are my citations. Yeah, essentially, I just really want people to start to think about whether this war is necessary, the pros, the cons, where the Western world fits into it, if they even do, and just try to find a viewpoint different from your own, because this does raise a lot of important but tricky questions. Yeah, thank you again for watching, and I will see you in class today.